Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts or the paranormal. I've always brushed off stories like that as exaggerated tales meant to scare people who are easily frightened. But what happened to me? What's still happening to me? I can't ignore it anymore. I need to write this down because I feel like I'm losing my mind. And if I don't get this out, I'm afraid the smoke will suffocate me. It all started last month when my friends and I, in a moment of pure boredom and stupidity, decided to play with a Ouija board. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Classic horror movie cliché, right? Believe me, if I could go back and slap the board out of Matt's hands, I would. But at the time, it just seemed like something dumb we could laugh about later. We were all at my place, hanging out late after a pretty uneventful Saturday. I've got this cozy old house I inherited from my grandparents. It's one of those places that creaks in all the wrong ways, but it never felt creepy to me. It just felt old. My friends and I had spent hundreds of nights there, playing video games, watching movies, and just messing around. That night, Matt shows up with this beat-up wooden box under his arm, smirking like he's got the funniest joke in the world. He dumps it on my coffee table, and inside is this Ouija board. It wasn't one of those cheap plastic ones from the toy store either. It looked ancient, like something you'd find in an attic where people don't go anymore. The wood was dark, almost black, with faint carvings worn down by time. The planchette was small, with a weird reddish tint, almost like it had been stained with something. But I didn't think much of it then. "Dude, where did you even get that thing?" I asked, half amused, half uneasy. "Some guy on Craigslist said it was an antique," Matt replied with a grin. "He gave it to me for like $20. Said he was moving and didn't want to take it with him." That should have been a red flag. Who just gives away a supposedly haunted Ouija board? We laughed about it for a while, the way you do when you're trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping up your spine. But we were curious too. None of us really believed it would work, but we set it up anyway, because why not? It's a game, right? The four of us, me, Matt, Rachel, and Josh, sat around the coffee table with the board in the middle. We lit a couple of candles because, honestly, we thought it would add to the vibe, not because we were taking it seriously. Matt and Rachel put their fingers on the planchette first, and we all started asking the usual questions you see in movies. You know, is anyone here with us? Or, can you give us a sign? Typical stuff. For the first 5 minutes, nothing happened. We all cracked jokes, accusing each other of trying to move the planchette. But then, the thing moved. Slowly, like it was dragging through molasses, the planchette slid to yes. I'll admit, I was freaked out, but I still thought one of them was messing with us. We kept asking questions, trying to get more specific. "Who are you? What do you want?" The answers were vague at first, just spelling out random letters that didn't seem to make sense. But then, it started spelling out something, over and over again. BURNME. We all stared at each other. It was Matt who broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "All right, real funny guys. Who's doing that?" But no one owned up to it. Rachel looked genuinely scared. She pulled her hands away from the planchette, and we all kind of sat there in this weird, uncomfortable silence. That's when Josh, who had been the biggest skeptic, said, "Screw this. Let's just do what it says and burn the damn thing." I wasn't thrilled about the idea. I didn't believe the board was really haunted, but something about destroying it felt wrong, like we were tempting fate in some twisted way. But everyone else was on board, no pun intended. So I didn't argue. We took the Ouija board out to my backyard and tossed it in the fire pit. Josh doused it with lighter fluid, and Matt flicked a match into the pit. The flames roared up higher than I expected, and we all took a step back. For a moment we stood there, watching the wood crackle and burn. But then something weird happened. Instead of burning like normal wood, the board started to glow, like there was some kind of heat radiating from inside it. The flames turned this eerie greenish colour, and I swear I could smell something foul. Not just burning wood, but something else. Like burnt hair or, I don't know, something worse. The whole time, none of us said a word. We just watched as the board turned to ash. I remember thinking that was it, that we'd just laugh about it later. But when the fire finally died down, the air was thick with smoke. The kind that lingers, gets into your clothes, your hair, everything. That's when the smell started. It was faint at first, like the remnants of a campfire. I didn't think much of it. But when we went back inside, I noticed it hadn't gone away. The air inside my house smelled like smoke, like something had burned right there in the living room. I opened windows, sprayed air freshener, but nothing worked. The smell stuck to everything, the walls, the furniture, my clothes. Even after taking a shower, it felt like the scent was clinging to my skin. I tried to sleep that night, but the smell was too much. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was breathing in smoke. It was suffocating. And then, I heard something, just a faint whisper, like someone was standing right next to me, their breath warm on my ear. Burn me! I shot out of bed, heart racing. I searched the house, convinced someone had broken in, but I found nothing. No one was there. But the smell, it was stronger than ever, and I swear, there was ash on my floor. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? After that whisper, after the ash, it felt like my house was alive, like something had slithered in and nestled itself right under the surface of my everyday life. Every corner I turned, every shadow that stretched across the walls, they felt wrong, like they weren't just shadows. But I pushed the feeling down. I convinced myself I was overreacting, letting my mind get the best of me. The next morning, I tried to go about my day as usual. I opened all the windows again, hoping some fresh air would clear the lingering smoke smell. The scent had seeped into everything. It was in the walls, the carpet, the drapes. Hell, even my bedsheet smelled like a bonfire. I figured it would fade eventually, so I left the house for a while, thinking maybe a few hours away would help reset my mind. I met up with Matt and the others later that day. I didn't tell them about the whisper, about how I was sure someone had been standing over my bed. I didn't want them thinking I'd lost it. But I asked them if their places smelled like smoke, just to see if it was only me. They all shook their heads, confused. Dude, my apartment smells totally fine. Why? Your house still reek of smoke? Matt asked, with a hint of amusement in his voice. He was always the kind to brush off weird stuff like that, laugh it off like it was no big deal. I nodded, trying to keep it casual. Yeah, it's weird. Maybe I just didn't air it out enough. They joked about it for a while, saying my house had become the world's worst air freshener, but I could see something in Rachel's eyes. She wasn't laughing like the others. After a while, when the conversation drifted to something else, she leaned over to me and whispered, I had a nightmare last night. I didn't want to say anything in front of the guys, but it was bad. Really bad. I felt my stomach tighten. What happened? She hesitated, then looked around as if making sure no one was listening. I dreamt I was in my room and everything was on fire, but the flames weren't normal. They were green, just like the fire from the Ouija board. I couldn't move. I was stuck there, watching my room burn, and I smelled smoke. Not in the dream. I could smell it for real. It was so strong, I thought my house was actually on fire. I tried to laugh it off, but the truth is, my hands started to shake. The fire pit from last night, the glowing flames, the smell of smoke. It wasn't just in my head. I wasn't the only one experiencing this. Whatever we had done, whatever that board was, it had followed us. I didn't tell her about the whisper in my ear, though. I wasn't ready to admit how bad things were getting. By the time I got home that evening, the smell was even worse. It was like someone had set a fire in the middle of my living room and let it smolder for hours. The air felt thick, almost oily, like it was pressing in on me. I was about to open the windows again when something caught my eye. A thin layer of ash, not just on the floor, but on the table, the couch, everywhere. I hadn't burned anything inside. The Ouija board was ashes, sure, but that had been outside. I knelt down to touch the ash, to see if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. The second my fingers brushed against it, I heard it again. That whisper. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was louder, clearer. Burn me. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding. The room felt like it was closing in on me. My hands were shaking, and I stumbled back, almost tripping over the coffee table. The whisper had come from right next to me. I was sure of it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaky and way too loud in the empty house. No response, just silence, and the smell of smoke. I backed up toward the front door, keeping my eyes on the living room like something was about to lunge at me. I grabbed my phone and dialed Matt. I didn't even care how insane I sounded at this point. I needed someone to hear this. "Matt, you need to get over here, now!" "What's up?" he asked, sounding half asleep. It was only 8 p.m, but I guess I'd woken him up from one of his infamous naps. "Something's wrong with my house. The smoke, the ash, it's everywhere. And I keep hearing..." I stopped myself. I didn't want to say it out loud. It felt too real, too crazy. He groaned. "Man, you're just freaking yourself out. Open a window, light a candle, and chill. You're fine. It's probably just leftover fumes from the fire pit." Before I could argue, the line went dead. My phone's battery had drained completely. It had been fully charged just an hour ago. I threw the phone down in frustration and ran my hands through my hair, trying to calm myself down. But as I stood there, breathing in that awful, suffocating smoke, I noticed something. The walls, the pale, cream-coloured walls of my living room were darkening, almost like they were burning. Thin lines of black were creeping up from the baseboards, like fingers reaching for the ceiling. I blinked, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the light. But no, the walls were charring, right in front of me, leaving behind trails of ash and soot. That's when I heard the creak. It came from behind me, down the hallway. Slow and deliberate, like someone was walking through the house, taking their time. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs, and slowly turned toward the sound. The hallway was dark, too dark considering all the lights were on. It was like the darkness had its own weight, pressing down on everything. And in the middle of that blackness, I saw something. No, I felt something. It was just a shadow at first, but as it moved closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was ash. Thick, swirling ash, twisting and writhing in the air, forming shapes that shouldn't be there. It slithered closer, and with every step it took, the smell of smoke grew stronger. And then I heard the whisper again. Louder this time. Almost a command. "Burn me!" I ran. Out the front door, into the street, not even bothering to lock up behind me. I didn't care. I needed to get away from the smell, from the ash, from whatever the hell was happening in my house. But as I stood in the middle of the street, gasping for breath, I realized something horrifying. The smoke wasn't just inside. It was following me. Standing in the middle of the street, the cold night air biting at my skin, I felt something I hadn't before. Pure dread. That suffocating smell of smoke wasn't just stuck inside my house anymore. It clung to the air around me, as if it had seeped into my very being. My heart pounded in my chest, and for the first time, I couldn't rationalize it away. Something was wrong, and I had no idea how to fix it. The street was quiet, eerily so. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves, but even that seemed muted. I looked back at my house, hoping, praying I wouldn't see anything out of the ordinary. But there it was, the unmistakable sight of ash swirling just outside my front door, moving like it had a life of its own. I needed help. Fast. I ran to my car parked in the driveway, fumbling with my keys. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped them, and as soon as I managed to unlock the door, I dove inside and slammed it shut, like it could somehow protect me from whatever was creeping through the air. But the second I turned the key in the ignition, I knew something was off. The car wouldn't start. The engine didn't even turn over. It was dead, just like my phone had been. I glanced at the dashboard, and sure enough, the battery light was blinking red. But here's the thing. I had just replaced the battery a few weeks ago. There was no way it should have been dead. My mind raced, searching for an explanation that made sense, but none came. Then I saw it. The ash. It was inside the car now, seeping through the air vents. It swirled in front of me, thickening like a cloud. And as it did, the smell of smoke grew stronger. It was almost unbearable now, making my eyes water, my throat burn. I reached for the door handle to get out, but before I could pull it open, something moved in the ash. At first, it was just a shape, vague, blurry, like looking at something through frosted glass. But then, it began to take form, slowly, deliberately. 2 dark holes where eyes should be, a mouth, twisted and gaping. A figure that didn't look entirely human, but not entirely inhuman either. It was like the smoke had moulded itself into a grotesque version of something that had once lived. And it was staring right at me. I felt my body freeze. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to get out, but I couldn't. It was like the air around me had thickened, trapping me in place. The figure in the ash tilted its head, its mouth opening wider, and then it spoke. Burn me. The words didn't come from its mouth. They didn't need to. They echoed in my head, a voice that was both inside me and all around me. The ash figure reached out, its hand, if you could call it that, extending toward me, fingers made of swirling soot. I threw myself out of the car, slamming the door behind me. I stumbled back into the street, gasping for breath, trying to shake the image from my mind. My head was spinning, and the world felt tilted, wrong. Nothing made sense anymore. I grabbed my phone, desperate for it to work this time. I didn't care about the dead battery. I just needed something, anything, to reach out for help. But as soon as I unlocked the screen, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a message waiting for me, a text, but I hadn't heard any notifications. It was from an unknown number. I clicked on it, my heart racing. Burn it. That's all it said. Just 2 words. But it was enough to send a wave of nausea crashing over me. I stared at the screen, hoping the words would disappear, that it was just some weird glitch. But they stayed, as if etched into the glass. Before I could think, my phone flickered and died again. The screen went black. I was alone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually the ash started to drift toward me again, swirling in the air, closer and closer. It moved like it was being drawn to me, like I was some kind of magnet for whatever this thing was. That's when I heard the creaking again, not from the house this time, but from behind me. I spun around, my heart in my throat. There, just down the street, was the figure. No longer just ash. It was solidifying, becoming something more real than before. It stood at the end of the block, motionless, its head tilted just like it had been in the car. And though its features were still obscured, I could feel its gaze locked onto me. Burn me. The voice rang out again, but this time it wasn't just in my head. It was real. I heard it, clear as day. It was coming from the figure at the end of the street, though its mouth hadn't moved. I backed away, my mind racing. What did it want from me? We'd already burned the board. We'd done exactly what it asked. Or had we? A memory flashed in my mind, something I hadn't thought about in the chaos of the last few days. When we burned the Ouija board, I hadn't stayed to watch it turn to ash. I'd been too creeped out and left before the fire fully died down. What if it wasn't completely gone? What if something remained, some part of it still out there, waiting? I didn't want to go back to that fire pit, but I didn't have a choice. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop, not until I did what it wanted. With shaking hands, I grabbed a flashlight from the garage and made my way to the backyard. The pit was still there, just as we'd left it, but something was wrong. Even from a distance, I could see it. The ashes, they were moving. As I got closer, I saw the truth. The remnants of the board weren't completely burned. Pieces of it remained, blackened but intact. And the ash around it was swirling, lifting into the air like it was being pulled into something unseen. I stood there staring as the ash continued to rise, taking on the same twisted shape I'd seen before. The figure, the one that had followed me from the house, was reforming right in front of me. Only this time, it was larger, more defined. And then, as the final piece of the Ouija board crumbled into dust, the figure stepped out of the pit. It wasn't just ash anymore, it was real. I don't know how to describe the feeling of seeing something that shouldn't exist step out of the ashes. It was like the world around me had suddenly shifted, like reality itself had cracked open just enough for this thing to crawl through. The figure was no longer just an unsettling shape in the smoke. It had form now, solid and real, but not human, not anymore. Its body was still made of swirling ash, but beneath that, there was something darker, something twisted. Its face was a mask of jagged shadows, eyes like hollowed-out pits. But worst of all, it had that mouth, that same gaping, twisted mouth that had haunted me in the car. And it was moving now, slowly stretching open wider, as if it was trying to speak, but no sound came out, only the distant crackle of burning wood. I couldn't move. My legs were cemented to the ground, and all I could do was stand there, gripping the flashlight so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The beam shook in my hands, but I forced myself to shine it directly at the figure, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to see it any clearer. The light didn't seem to bother it. In fact, as soon as the beam hit it, the ash around its body seemed to shimmer, like the particles were reflecting the light in an unnatural way. And then, as if to mock me, it took a step forward. The ground beneath its feet blackened instantly, like the grass had been scorched by a fire too hot for this world. "Burn me." The words came again, but this time they didn't echo in my head. They came from it. The figure's mouth moved, the ash swirling in a grotesque imitation of speech. The sound wasn't right. It was like listening to a recording played backward, distorted and wrong. My stomach twisted at the sound, and the smell of smoke thickened in the air. I couldn't breathe. The smell was suffocating now, filling my lungs with every gasp. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight, my hands frantically reaching for something, anything, to hold on to. The figure kept advancing, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. And then, something snapped inside me. A thought that broke through the haze of fear clouding my brain. The Ouija board. I hadn't burned it completely. That's why this thing was still here. That's why it was following me. My eyes darted to the fire pit. The last remnants of the board were still there, scattered in the ashes, the charred pieces that hadn't been fully consumed by the flames. If I could just burn the rest, if I could finish what we started, maybe this would end. Without thinking, I lunged toward the pit, grabbing the scattered pieces of the board with trembling hands. The wood was cold and damp, but I didn't care. I piled them into the center of the pit, my heart racing. I needed fire. I needed to finish this before that thing got any closer. I fumbled for my lighter, my hands shaking so badly it almost slipped from my grip. The figure was only a few feet away now, its form towering over me. I could feel the heat radiating off of it, even though it hadn't touched me yet. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural glow, like the embers of a dying fire. I flicked the lighter, the tiny flame bursting to life in the darkness. My hands were sweating, slipping on the cold metal, but I didn't have time to think. I leaned forward and set the flame to the charred wood. For a moment, nothing happened. The pieces of the board just sat there, smouldering but not catching fire. The figure was right behind me now, so close I could feel its breath, or whatever passed for breath, on the back of my neck. My skin crawled, and I could hear the crackling sound of burning, even though the fire hadn't started yet. And then the wood ignited. Flames roared to life in the pit, brighter and hotter than they should have been. The fire was wild, consuming the last remnants of the board in seconds, the heat so intense I had to shield my face. But as the flames grew, I saw something in the fire. The ash figure. It was changing. Its form began to flicker, like a candle caught in the wind. The swirling ash that made up its body seemed to disintegrate, breaking apart and drifting toward the flames. The figure's head tilted back, its mouth opening wide in a silent scream, and for a split second, I thought I heard something faint, like a voice carried on the wind. And then, it was gone. The figure dissolved into the fire, consumed by the flames, until there was nothing left but the crackling of the burning wood. I stood there, staring at the pit, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The smell of smoke was still thick in the air, but the suffocating, burning stench that had clung to me for days was fading. I could breathe again. I took a step back, my legs trembling, and collapsed onto the ground. My head was spinning, my heart still pounding in my chest. The fire burned for a while longer, but as the last piece of wood crumbled into ash, I realized something. The smell of smoke. It was still there. It wasn't as strong as before, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. I could still smell it, faint and lingering, like a campfire that had just burned out. I glanced around, half expecting the figure to reappear, but the yard was empty. I wanted to believe it was over, that burning the board had worked, that whatever we'd unleashed had been destroyed. But deep down, I knew the truth. The ash might be gone, but the fire was still burning. It's been 3 days since I burned the last piece of the Ouija board, and yet I still smell smoke. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, the lingering fear messing with my senses. But no matter what I did, how many windows I opened, how much I cleaned, how much fresh air I forced through the house, the scent stayed, faint but persistent, like an invisible fire smouldering beneath the surface. I told myself it would fade. I wanted to believe that everything was over, that the ash figure was gone, consumed by the flames just like the board. But the truth gnawed at me. There was something I couldn't shake, a creeping unease that followed me from room to room. Every time I took a deep breath, I smelled it. Smoke, burned wood, and something else. Something foul, like charred flesh. By the third night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every distant sound made me jump. My mind was playing tricks on me, twisting every shadow into something alive. I hadn't told anyone what had really happened, not even Matt or Rachel. They didn't need to know. This was my burden to carry, and I didn't want to drag them deeper into whatever this was. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the smell of smoke thickening again. The quiet hum of the night outside seemed wrong, too still, too silent. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it. The creak. It wasn't like before, the slow groaning of the house settling. This was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like footsteps moving down the hall. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't in my head. Someone was walking through my house. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy flashlight, and crept out of bed, my hands slick with sweat. The air was heavy with that smoky stench again, more suffocating than ever before. I stepped into the hallway, my eyes straining in the dim light. The creaking stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something to move, for the footsteps to start again. But the house was still, too still. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl, like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. At the end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dark, was the faintest wisp of smoke. It curled through the air, drifting toward me, as if beckoning me to follow it. My stomach lurched, and I forced myself to take a step back. But as I did, the smoke thickened, twisting and coiling like it had a mind of its own. It wasn't just lingering in the air anymore. It was moving. I stumbled backward into the living room, flashlight trembling in my hand. The smoke followed, snaking through the air like a living thing, slithering across the floor toward me. I could feel the heat building again, like standing too close to a fire. My throat burned. My lungs ached. Every breath was filled with smoke, as though the walls themselves were catching fire. Then I heard it. That voice. Burn me. It was louder this time, almost angry. A command, a demand, growing more insistent with every second. I spun around, searching the room, but there was nothing, just the smoke, creeping closer, filling the space like a storm cloud. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. And then I saw it. The fireplace. The only place in the house where I could make fire. I ran to it, fumbling with the fireplace tools, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. The smoke was everywhere now, swirling around me, pressing in from all sides. I could hear the crackling of flames, but there was no fire. Not yet. My mind raced back to what the board had told us, what the ash figure had said over and over. Burn me. What if it wasn't the board that needed to burn? What if it was something else? I didn't have time to think. I grabbed a match from the box on the mantel, struck it, and threw it into the fireplace. The flames roared to life instantly, hotter and more intense than they should have been. The heat slammed into me, almost knocking me back. And then, from within the smoke, I saw it. The figure. The same one that had haunted me in the car, in the backyard, in every shadowed corner of my mind. It was emerging from the smoke again, but this time, it didn't stay ash. It solidified, stepping out of the swirling darkness, its hollow eyes locked onto me. Burn me. The voice came again, louder, more insistent, almost desperate now. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward the fire, as if begging for release. I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do, my mind screaming at me to run. But something kept me there, something pulling me toward the flames. The smoke was suffocating now, filling every inch of the room, wrapping around me like a shroud. The figure took another step, closer to the fire, its body flickering like a dying ember. Burn me! The voice was almost pleading now. Without thinking, I grabbed the last remaining piece of the Ouija board, the tiny planchette that had somehow ended up on my mantel, and threw it into the fire. The flames flared, engulfing the wood, crackling and roaring louder than ever. And then, the figure stepped into the fire. For a moment, everything stopped. The smoke, the heat, the voice, everything went silent. I watched, breathless, as the figure dissolved into the flames, its form breaking apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the crackle of burning wood. The smoke cleared. The smell of ash faded. And just like that, it was over. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The fire burned quietly in the hearth now, a normal fire, with no sign of the horror that had haunted me for days. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the flames, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The house was quiet, the air was clear, and the smell of smoke was finally gone. I should have felt relieved, but instead, there was a weight on my chest, a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach. The fire had taken the figure, sure, but something told me that it wasn't gone, not completely. It had burned, but the flame had only just begun. Okay, before anyone jumps to conclusions or calls me insane, hear me out. I know it sounds ridiculous. Why would anyone use a Ouija board to try and contact a spirit in Antarctica? Believe me, I didn't think it would work either. It started as one of those dumb late-night what if scenarios between a few friends, something to pass the time and get a laugh. But I can tell you now, it's no joke. And I'm genuinely scared that something is coming for us. It all began a few weeks ago on one of those cold, quiet nights where it felt like the world was holding its breath. You know the kind, when everything seems too still. I was hanging out with my friends in my apartment. There were 4 of us. Me, obviously, Tony, Emily, and Katie. We're the kind of friends who are always chasing the next thrill, trying to outdo each other with dares or weird challenges. But this time, it was Tony who brought up the Ouija board. I read this thing online, Tony said, pulling his phone out, about an abandoned Antarctic research station. Supposedly, some of the scientists who stayed there started acting weird, talking about something under the ice before they disappeared. Like the thing from The Thing? Emily asked, half joking. She never really believed in any of this paranormal stuff, but she was always game for a laugh. Sort of, but this is real, Tony continued, getting more excited. They say there's a spirit trapped in the ice, and people who've tried to communicate with it have gone missing. I figured, why not try it ourselves? I should have known Tony was serious. He always had a way of making even the dumbest ideas seem plausible. So, against my better judgment, I went along with it. We'd messed around with Ouija boards before. Most of the time, it was just pranks or us psyching each other out. But something about this time felt different, heavier. We dimmed the lights, lit a couple of candles, because Tony insisted it set the mood, and pulled out the board. Emily rolled her eyes, and Katie shifted nervously in her seat, biting her lip. Despite her reluctance, she was the one who pulled out her phone to record the whole thing. You know, just in case something interesting happened. Looking back, I wish she hadn't. Tony started the session. He was always the leader in these things. We all placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, and Tony began asking the typical questions. Is anyone here with us? Nothing. Are there any spirits who want to communicate? Still nothing. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe this was going to be another one of those pointless sessions, where nothing happens and we all go to bed laughing about how stupid it was. But then, the planchette moved. Not much, just a small twitch, but enough to make us all freeze. Did someone just move that? Katie asked, her voice trembling slightly. No one moved it, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. My hand was shaking a little, and I figured maybe one of us had shifted accidentally. Tony, of course, grinned like a kid on Christmas morning. Let's ask something more specific, he said, leaning forward. Is the spirit from the Antarctic research station? I don't know if it was my imagination or if we were all just collectively freaking each other out, but the planchette slid to yes, slowly, deliberately. We exchanged nervous glances, but Tony, as always, pressed on. Are you trapped there? Again, it moved to yes. At this point, my heart was racing. I could hear Katie's breathing quicken beside me. Emily, who had been skeptical from the start, suddenly looked pale, her eyes darting between us as if trying to figure out who was pulling the strings. But none of us were pushing it. I could feel it. Tony was relentless. Can we help you? This time, the planchette moved in a strange, jerky pattern, as if whoever, or whatever, was controlling it, was struggling to communicate. It stopped on the letter R, then U, then N. Run? Katie whispered, her voice barely audible. Why would it tell us to run? I didn't know the answer to that, and I didn't want to find out. But Tony, ever the thrill-seeker, laughed it off. "It's probably just a joke, Spirit. Chill, it's all part of the experience." Except, it didn't feel like a joke. The air in the room had shifted, grown colder, heavier. I swear I saw my breath mist in front of me, but that had to be impossible. We were indoors, for God's sake. Suddenly, the candle nearest to us flickered and went out. That was enough for Emily. She shot up from her seat, backing away from the table. "I'm done," she muttered, clearly rattled. "This is too much." We all agreed to stop. The energy in the room was too intense, too unsettling, and none of us could shake the feeling that we'd crossed some kind of line. Tony, reluctantly, moved the planchette to "goodbye," and we packed up the board. But it wasn't over. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my room, trying to calm myself down. It had just been a stupid game, right? Something that went wrong because of our overactive imaginations. But as I was lying in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, I heard something. A faint tapping noise coming from my window. I live on the 3rd floor of my building. There shouldn't have been anything, or anyone, outside my window. But the tapping continued, slow and rhythmic. I didn't dare get up to check. Instead, I pulled the covers tighter around myself and prayed for it to stop. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as a nightmare, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that whatever we had contacted wasn't just a figment of our imagination. It felt real, and it felt close. I haven't told my friends about the tapping yet. I'm hoping it was just a fluke, something explainable. But in the pit of my stomach, I know it wasn't. Whatever we spoke to in Antarctica, it's not just a spirit trapped in the ice, it's something much worse. And I'm afraid it's coming for us. The morning after the Ouija session, I woke up feeling off. You know that sensation when you're being watched, even though you're alone? That's exactly how I felt, except it clung to me, shadowing every move I made. It wasn't just paranoia either. There were small things happening, like objects not being where I left them, or a strange draft in the apartment, despite the windows being sealed tight. At first, I tried to brush it off as lingering nerves from the night before, but it soon became impossible to ignore. Later that day, Tony called me. His voice was uncharacteristically tense, like someone had sucked all the humor out of him. "Dude, I think we messed up." I didn't want to admit it, but the same fear had been gnawing at me since the moment we closed the session. Why? What happened? It's not just me. Emily and Katie. Something's wrong with them too. Tony paused for a second, and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. Emily hasn't slept. She says she keeps hearing someone whispering her name when she's alone. And Katie, man, she said she saw something outside her house last night, just standing there in her yard. A chill ran through me as he spoke. I hadn't told anyone about the tapping at my window, but now, with everything Tony was saying, it felt connected. None of this was a coincidence. "Have you seen anything?" I asked, almost dreading his response. Tony hesitated. "Not seen, but I swear, something's following me. Everywhere I go, I feel like I'm not alone. Like there's this presence right behind me, watching." The weight in his voice made my skin crawl. This wasn't the Tony I knew. The guy who always brushed things off with a joke or a laugh sounded genuinely scared. "What do we do?" I whispered, suddenly feeling very small, like a kid who'd broken something valuable and couldn't figure out how to fix it. Tony sighed, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I don't know, man. Maybe we should get rid of the board, burn it or something." I agreed, but part of me wondered if that would make any difference. Whatever we had stirred up felt far beyond our control. A simple fire wasn't going to undo the mess we had made. That night, I locked my door and closed all the windows tight, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Worse, it was starting to manifest in more direct ways. Around midnight, just as I was about to fall asleep, my phone lit up on the nightstand. The screen displayed an incoming video call, but the number was one I didn't recognize. No caller ID, no name, just a series of scrambled digits. Curiosity and fear wrestled inside me, but I couldn't stop myself from answering. I held the phone up, expecting some prank, or maybe just a glitch, but what I saw chilled me to my core. The screen showed a black and white video feed of what appeared to be an empty room. It was stark and bare, like a room in some old abandoned building. At first, there was nothing, just grainy footage. But as I squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of it, something moved. A shadow. No, not a shadow. A figure, just barely visible, as if it was standing at the very edge of the camera's view. It didn't move towards the camera, didn't do anything dramatic. It just stood there, watching, waiting. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. I just knew it had something to do with the Ouija session. I wasn't the only one in danger. Whatever we had contacted had found us all. The next day, I met up with the group. We decided to burn the Ouija board, Tony's idea. It seemed like the only logical step, as if destroying it would sever the connection we'd made. We gathered at Tony's place, out in his backyard, and threw the board into a fire pit. The flames licked at the edges of the board, curling the wood as it burned, but something about it felt wrong. As we watched it burn, Katie suddenly stepped back, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" We all froze, listening. At first I didn't hear anything, just the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of cars from the street. But then it came. A soft, eerie voice, barely audible, carried on the wind. It was speaking. No, more like whispering. R-U-N. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was the same message we'd gotten from the board the night before. I turned to Tony, who looked as pale as I felt. Emily was backing away from the fire, her eyes locked on the burning board, as if it might suddenly leap out of the pit. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't know what we'd done, but every instinct in my body was telling me to leave, to put as much distance between us and whatever we had summoned. But just as I turned to leave, something cold brushed against my arm. I looked down, expecting to see a branch or something brushing against me. But there was nothing. The air had gone ice cold, freezing even though it was a mild evening. Katie gasped, staring at the sky. "Look!" We all turned. Above us, the clouds had started swirling, almost unnaturally. But that wasn't the worst part. There was something in the center of the spiral. Something dark. It was hard to make out, like a shadow that didn't belong there, moving against the wind. Whatever it was coming for us. We ran. None of us looked back, not even Tony, who was usually the bravest of the group. As we scattered, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Another message. It was from that same scrambled number, and the text read, "You can't escape." I didn't reply. I couldn't. My hands were shaking too much. All I knew was that whatever we had contacted wasn't just some spirit in Antarctica. It was real, and it was coming for us. That night I barely slept, every creak and groan of my apartment making me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, waiting, watching, and I knew it wouldn't be long before it found us. After the night we burned the Ouija board, things only got worse. It wasn't just the strange messages or that looming presence we all felt. It was as if something had followed each of us home, something that wanted us to know it was there, always there, lurking just out of sight. I thought maybe I was just losing my mind, that the fear and anxiety were making me see things that weren't there. But then Katie called. The second I heard her voice, I knew things were about to take an even darker turn. "You need to come over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now." I didn't hesitate. Katie lived only a few blocks away, and the walk felt like it took forever. As I moved through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following me. My heart raced with every step, and every time I glanced over my shoulder, I swore I saw something in the shadows, something shifting, darting just out of sight. But whenever I stopped to look closer, there was nothing. When I finally reached Katie's place, she opened the door before I even knocked. Her eyes were red, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Without saying a word, she motioned for me to come inside. The second I stepped into her apartment, I felt it, a suffocating heaviness, like the air itself was pressing down on us. Katie led me to her living room. She didn't need to explain what had happened. I could see it for myself. Scattered across the floor were dozens of photographs, Polaroids. Each one showed Katie's house from different angles, the front yard, the windows, the back door. But the most unsettling part was that in every single photo, there was something barely visible in the background. A figure, faceless, blurred, but unmistakably there, standing in the shadows. "Who took these?" I asked, my voice shaky as I knelt to examine them closer. Katie shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "They were in my mailbox this morning. I don't know who took them. I didn't hear anything last night, but I feel like someone's been watching me. It's getting worse." I tried to keep my composure, but inside I was terrified. This wasn't just some prank, some overactive imagination. Something, or someone, had been watching Katie, and whoever it was, they were getting closer. Tony and Emily arrived not long after. Tony, ever the one to downplay things, looked shaken for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Emily barely spoke, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to ward off the cold, though the apartment was warm. "We need to figure this out," Tony said, his voice tight. "This thing, whatever it is, it's not stopping." "I've been seeing things," Emily whispered, her eyes wide and vacant. "Shadows, in the corners of my room, in the mirrors. I'll catch a glimpse of something, just for a second, but when I turn to look, it's gone." She wasn't the only one. I had been seeing them too, those fleeting dark figures. They never lingered long enough for me to get a good look, but I could feel them, watching, waiting. We sat in silence for a long time, each of us wrestling with the growing dread that had settled over us. Finally, Katie spoke up. "We should never have done it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Ouija board. Contacting that thing. Whatever it is, we let it out, and now it's coming for us." Tony shook his head, rubbing his face with his hands. "I didn't think this stuff was real. I thought it was just a stupid game." "Well, it's real now," I muttered, my eyes drifting back to the photos on the floor. Each image felt like a warning, a reminder that no matter what we did, we weren't safe. That night, we all decided to stick together at Katie's place. Strength in numbers, we thought. Maybe whatever was out there wouldn't come for us if we weren't alone. But we were wrong. As the hours ticked by, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt thick, oppressive, and none of us could shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every little noise made us jump, a creak in the floorboards, the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves outside. It all felt wrong, like the world itself was bending under the weight of something unnatural. Around midnight, the temperature in the apartment plummeted. It was like someone had thrown open a freezer door, except all the windows were shut and the heat was still on. We huddled together in the living room, barely speaking, each of us too scared to say what we were all thinking. And then the lights went out. It happened so fast. 1 second, the room was dimly lit by the lamps. The next, we were plunged into complete darkness. I heard Katie gasp, and Tony muttered a curse under his breath. I fumbled for my phone, the dim light of the screen offering little comfort in the oppressive blackness. "Everyone stay calm," Tony said, though his voice betrayed him. He was as scared as the rest of us. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, a low, rhythmic tapping, just like the one I'd heard at my window that first night. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the walls, or maybe from above us. I couldn't tell. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from all around us. Katie whimpered, her voice small in the dark. "What is that?" None of us had an answer. Suddenly there was a loud bang from the kitchen, like something heavy had fallen or been thrown. I jumped up, my heart racing, and Tony grabbed a flashlight from his bag, shining it toward the source of the noise. Nothing. The kitchen was empty. No signs of anything out of place. No reason for the noise. But as the beam of light swept across the room, something moved. Just for a second, in the corner of the kitchen, something dark, hunched, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward the ceiling. Tony saw it too. He froze, the flashlight trembling in his hands. What the hell was that? Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered back on, and the coldness in the room seemed to lift, as if whatever presence had been there was suddenly gone. But I didn't believe it. None of us did. We didn't sleep that night. None of us even closed our eyes. Every time I so much as blinked, I could see that thing from the kitchen, lurking just beyond the light, watching us. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and left Katie's apartment, each of us silently agreeing that we couldn't stay there any longer. But deep down, I knew running wouldn't help, because whatever we had contacted, it wasn't done with us yet. After we left Katie's apartment that morning, the four of us tried to go back to some semblance of normalcy, but nothing felt normal anymore. Even in broad daylight, there was this underlying tension, a gnawing sensation that we weren't alone, like something had latched onto us, waiting. Every time my phone buzzed or my door creaked, I flinched, expecting another message or something worse. A few days passed, and though we all kept in touch, none of us mentioned the thing we'd seen in Katie's kitchen. It was like we were too afraid to talk about it, as if saying it aloud would somehow make it more real. But the silence didn't help. Whatever it was getting bolder. It was a Wednesday afternoon when I got the call from Tony. His voice was rushed, panicked. "Get to my place. Now." I didn't need any more information. I grabbed my keys and left without a second thought. When I arrived, I found Tony pacing outside his apartment, his hands clenched into fists. His usual bravado had completely vanished, replaced with wide-eyed fear. "Something's in there," he said, pointing to his apartment door. His voice trembled as he spoke, and that alone sent a shiver down my spine. Tony never got scared. He was the guy who laughed in the face of danger, the one who always had a smart-ass comment ready. But now, he looked like he was on the edge of losing it. "What do you mean something?" I asked, glancing at the door. Just come inside. You'll see." I followed him in, and the second I stepped over the threshold, I felt it. That same heavy, suffocating presence from Katie's apartment. It was as though the air itself was charged, vibrating with an invisible tension that made it hard to breathe. Tony led me to his living room, where something bizarre caught my eye immediately. His television screen was on, but it wasn't displaying anything normal. No channels, no menus, just static, white noise. And within the static, there were shadows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the mind, but as I squinted at the screen, I could see the faint outline of a figure, standing, staring. "Is that—" I started, but Tony cut me off. "Watch." I did, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the figure on the screen turned. Its head tilted slightly, as if it knew we were watching, and then it pointed, not toward anything on the screen, but toward us, right at us. I staggered back, my heart racing. "What the hell, Tony? How is this even happening?" "I don't know," he whispered, rubbing his temples. "It started this morning. The TV just turned on by itself and that thing appeared. It's been doing that ever since, just standing there, watching, and sometimes..." His voice trailed off, and he swallowed hard before continuing. Sometimes I think I hear it whispering. From the TV. We turned the TV off after that, but the sense of dread in the room didn't leave. I convinced Tony to stay with me for the night, even though neither of us believed it would keep the thing from following. Whatever it wasn't bound to a location. It had become part of our lives now, an unshakable shadow lurking in every corner. That night, I barely slept. Tony and I camped out in my living room, but no matter how much I tried to relax, the feeling of being watched persisted. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, it all felt deliberate, like something was trying to break through. I could sense it, hovering just beyond the walls, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Around 3 a.m., the nightmares started. I hadn't fallen asleep for more than a few minutes when I was jolted awake by the most vivid dream I'd ever had. I was standing in the middle of a frozen wasteland, the wind howling around me. The air was so cold, it burned my skin, and in the distance, I could see the dark silhouette of a structure. It looked like an abandoned station, the kind of place you'd find in the middle of Antarctica. I didn't want to approach, but something was pulling me toward it. As I got closer, I saw figures moving inside, slow, disjointed shapes that seemed almost human, but not quite. Their movements were wrong, like they were being controlled by invisible strings. Puppets jerked about in the icy wind. Suddenly, one of the figures turned, locking eyes with me through the broken window of the station. It was the same shadowy figure from the TV, its form dark and featureless, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't speak, but I could feel its intent, its cold hatred wrapping around me like chains. I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to wake Tony, but he was already sitting up, his eyes wide and filled with the same terror I felt. I had the same dream, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Neither of us slept after that. We just sat there, staring at the walls, waiting for the next sign. And it wasn't long before it came. Just as the first light of dawn began creeping through the windows, there was a knock at the door. It was soft, almost polite, but it made my blood run cold. Tony and I exchanged a look, neither of us wanting to answer it. But the knocking continued, slowly, insistently. Maybe it's Katie or Emily, Tony suggested, though we both knew it wasn't. I got up, my legs shaking as I approached the door. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears, I thought it might drown out everything else. I peered through the peephole, but what I saw on the other side made me recoil in horror. It was the figure. The same shadowy thing from the TV, from my nightmare. It stood just outside the door, its face, or what passed for a face, mere inches from the peephole. I could feel its presence radiating through the door, cold and suffocating, as if the very air around it had turned to ice. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. "It's here," I managed to choke out. "It's right outside." Tony's face drained of colour. He stood frozen in place, his eyes wide and unblinking. The knocking stopped, but before we could catch our breath, something far worse happened. The lights began flickering. Not just the overhead lights, but every source of light, lamps, the glow from the microwave, even our phone screens. They all pulsed in sync, casting long dancing shadows across the room. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went dark. No flickering, no dimming, just pure, unrelenting darkness. And in that suffocating blackness, I heard it. The voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder, clearer, until it felt like it was coming from all directions at once. "Come with me," it said, the voice cold and empty. "You can't run forever." I felt Tony's hand grab my arm, and we both backed up, pressing ourselves against the far wall. We couldn't see anything, but we knew it was there, somewhere in the dark, waiting. The voice echoed again, this time with more force. "Come with me." And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the power came back on. The lights flared to life, banishing the darkness. But the fear didn't leave with it. It stayed, clinging to us like a second skin. Whatever we had contacted wasn't just trying to scare us anymore. It wanted us. And I had no idea how long we could keep running. After that night, it was clear we were out of time. There was no denying it anymore. Something had crossed over, something dark and relentless. Tony and I spent the next day in a daze, neither of us able to shake the horror of what we'd heard, of what had stood outside my door. Every second felt like a countdown, ticking away towards some inevitable, unknown disaster. Emily was the first to call, her voice shaky and desperate. "I can't stay in my apartment anymore," she said. "It's everywhere. The shadows, they move even when the lights are on. I swear I saw someone standing in my hallway last night, but when I turned on the light, they were gone." We all agreed to meet at Tony's place again. It was the only thing we could think to do, stick together, hoping that our numbers would somehow keep us safe. But deep down, I think we all knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever this was, it was beyond anything we could handle. By the time Katie arrived, it was already getting dark. She looked worse than I'd ever seen her, pale, hollow-eyed, like she hadn't slept in days. She kept glancing over her shoulder, flinching at every sound. "They're coming," she whispered as she stepped through the door. "I know it. I can feel them." No one needed to ask who she meant. We all felt it too, that same suffocating presence that had been hovering around us since the night we used the Ouija board. Except now, it wasn't just watching. It was closing in. We tried to talk, to make sense of what was happening, but every conversation felt pointless. There was no logic to this, no way to explain it or fight it. We had opened a door to something we didn't understand, and now we were paying the price. Tony paced the room, his hands running through his hair, mumbling to himself. "There has to be something we can do. People survive this kind of stuff, right? Maybe we can..." His voice cut off suddenly, and he froze mid-step, staring at the TV. It had turned on by itself again, the screen flickering with static. But this time, there was no shadowy figure. There was nothing, just the crackling white noise. We all watched, holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, the screen went black, and a single message appeared in plain white letters. "Your time is up." The words stayed on the screen for only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. No one moved, no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, and then the lights went out again. I could hear Katie's ragged breathing beside me, feel the tremble of Tony's hand as he reached out in the dark. The room was so quiet, so still, that even the smallest sound seemed deafening. Then came the knocking. It started softly, just like the night before, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. But this time, it wasn't at the door. It was coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor beneath our feet, surrounding us. Emily whimpered in the darkness, her voice barely audible. "It's here." The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the walls themselves were trembling. And then came the voice. That same cold, empty voice that had whispered to us before, only now it was louder, clearer, and far too close. "You can't run. You can't hide." I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was Tony or maybe it was me. But suddenly we were all scrambling to the front door, desperate to get out, to escape. But as soon as we reached it, the knocking stopped, and the door wouldn't open. Tony pulled at the handle, throwing his weight against the door, but it didn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut, trapping us inside. Katie screamed, backing away from the door, her hands over her ears. "Make it stop! Please, make it stop!" The air around us grew colder, freezing even. My breath came out in white puffs, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, numbing my fingers. And then, In the midst of the chaos, I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows gathered darkest, it appeared. The figure. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer just a flicker on a screen. It was here, standing in the corner of Tony's living room, its form blacker than the surrounding darkness, like a void. It had no face, no eyes, but I knew it was looking at us. I could feel it. And then it started to move. It didn't walk. It glided, its limbs long and twisted, almost too thin to be human. The room grew colder with each step it took toward us, the darkness spreading out around it like a living thing. "We have to do something," Tony shouted, grabbing a chair and hurling it at the thing. But it passed right through. The figure paused, standing still in the center of the room, and for a brief, horrifying moment, everything was silent. Then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged. It was fast, too fast for us to react. One moment, it was across the room, and the next, it was right in front of me. I felt a cold, burning sensation wrap around my chest, and I couldn't breathe. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room, and the darkness was closing in on me, suffocating me. I heard Emily scream, and then Katie, but their voices sounded distant, muffled, like they were fading away. The cold wrapped tighter around me, and I could feel my body shutting down, slipping into the darkness. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the cold released its grip. I gasped for air, stumbling backward, and when I looked up, the figure was gone. The lights flickered back on, and everything was still. Emily was on the floor, shaking, her back pressed against the wall. Katie was sobbing uncontrollably, and Tony was slumped in a chair, staring blankly at the spot where the figure had been. None of us spoke for a long time. We didn't need to. We knew it wasn't over. Whatever that thing was, it had marked us, and it wasn't finished yet. The sun was rising outside by the time we finally found the courage to leave Tony's apartment. We didn't say goodbye. We just left. Each of us went our separate ways, but we all knew we weren't really going anywhere. Because whatever we had summoned, it would find us again. It always did. And next time, we might not be so lucky. I'll admit, it started off as a joke. One of those just for fun moments that spirals out of control. My friends and I had been browsing through the dark web. Yeah, stupid, I know. We weren't there for anything serious, just the usual curiosity. Weird videos, strange forums, and occasionally the really out there conspiracy stuff. One night, after we'd all had a couple of beers, someone, Jared I think, came up with the idea to buy an old Ouija board from the dark web. Not just any Ouija board though. This one was advertised as ancient, with carvings on it that supposedly weren't even human. The description was vague, claiming it was found in the wreckage of some old military site, which just added to the mystique. We were all laughing about it, and Jared, always the one to push things too far, bought it. A week later, the board arrived at his place. It didn't look that old, to be honest. If anything, it seemed like a poorly aged knockoff. But the symbols carved into the wood were different. They didn't look like any language I'd seen before. Weird geometric patterns that twisted and looped around each other. Some of the symbols felt uncomfortable to look at, like your brain couldn't quite process what they meant. Anyway, we set it up in Jared's living room, dimmed the lights, and made it into a whole event. Honestly, I didn't expect anything to happen. None of us did. We started off by asking the usual stuff, basic Ouija board questions. Is anyone here with us? Can you give us a sign? The pointer barely moved, and when it did, we were convinced someone was nudging it for kicks. But then, something shifted. The board wasn't giving us yes or no answers anymore. The pointer started sliding over the strange symbols instead. Jared swore he wasn't moving it. I thought maybe it was one of the others, but everyone seemed off. The room felt heavier, and the laughter died down fast. The pointer spelled out a sequence of symbols I couldn't make sense of. "What does it mean?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. No one answered. We just stared at the board, at the strange markings it was pointing to. Then, out of nowhere, Jared jerked his hand back like he'd been burned. "What the hell, man?" he muttered, shaking his hand out. It shocked me. I wanted to leave right then. Something didn't feel right. But instead of listening to that gut feeling, we decided to push on. Jared insisted we keep asking questions, but this time I noticed something weird. My skin, just below my wrist, felt itchy. I scratched at it absent-mindedly, thinking it was nothing. After about 10 minutes of getting no clear answers from the board, we called it quits. The mood had soured, and everyone was getting creeped out. Jared packed the board away, and we all left his place, pretending like it was no big deal. But the itching on my arm got worse on the drive home. When I finally looked down at it, I froze. There, on my skin, was one of the symbols from the board. The same twisting, looping pattern we'd seen earlier. I tried rubbing it off, thinking maybe it was just some kind of weird imprint or rash, but it wouldn't go away. It wasn't raised or painful, just there, like a tattoo that had appeared out of nowhere. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd pressed my arm against the board or something. But the next morning, there were more. Small, faint, but unmistakable. They were spreading, curling up my wrist and forearm in a delicate, eerie pattern. Panic set in. I called Jared. He didn't answer at first, so I texted him, telling him what had happened. His response came hours later, and when it did, it wasn't reassuring. "Dude, I've got the same thing, on my neck." We decided to meet up later that day to figure out what was going on. Maybe it was all just some weird coincidence. Maybe it would fade on its own. But something deep in my gut told me it wasn't that simple. The symbols weren't fading. They were multiplying. And worse, they were starting to look familiar. Not in the way you recognize a language, but in the way your mind starts piecing together things it shouldn't. Late that night, while I lay in bed, I saw them, flashing behind my closed eyelids, twisting, pulsating like a heartbeat. I couldn't escape them. The more I stared at the symbols on my skin, the more they seemed to glow, softly, like an unnatural light from beneath the surface. And then, the dreams began. If you can even call them dreams. Flashes of something dark, something huge watching me. I could never see it, but I could feel its gaze, and the symbols. They weren't just symbols anymore. They were instructions, or warnings. But of what? That was the question I was terrified to answer. Whatever we'd summoned or contacted, it wasn't done with us yet. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, those symbols danced across my vision. They twisted, pulsed, and seemed to rearrange themselves in patterns that made less and less sense the longer I watched. It felt like my mind was getting tangled in them, like if I stared too long, I'd forget how to think properly. By the time the sun finally rose, I felt more drained than when I'd first crawled into bed. When Jared showed up the next morning, he didn't look much better. He had that same tired, haunted look I imagined was plastered all over my own face. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the symbol on his neck. It wasn't just sitting there anymore. It was moving. I didn't believe it at first, thought my mind was playing tricks on me from all the sleepless hours. But no, right there, just below his ear, the mark was writhing. Slowly, like it was alive, shifting across his skin in these slow, deliberate motions. My stomach dropped. "Jared, does it hurt?" He shook his head, his face pale. "Number, but I can feel it. I don't know, like it's crawling under my skin. Dude, it won't stop." I had no idea what to say. We sat there in my living room, the curtains drawn tight to block out the morning light, staring at his neck like it was some kind of living nightmare. Every instinct in my body told me to run, to get as far away from him as possible. But I couldn't. The same thing was happening to me, slowly, quietly, and it was only a matter of time before my own marks started moving too. Maybe we should see a doctor, I suggested, though the words felt stupid, even as they left my mouth. What was I going to tell a doctor? That we played with an ancient Ouija board, and now it was doing this to us? They'd laugh us out of the office, or worse, they'd think we were on something. No, Jared said quickly, shaking his head. We can't. They won't understand. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration written all over his face. We need to figure out what those symbols mean. I've been trying to look them up online, but there's nothing. It's like they don't exist. That's when it hit me. The dark web. It was a long shot, but if that board came from some deep corner of the internet, maybe the same place had more information about it. I didn't want to go back there. I swore I wouldn't after what happened, but I couldn't just sit around and let these marks take over my body without doing something. We booted up Jared's laptop, the one he used to access the dark web. I could feel my hands sweating as I watched him navigate through the layers of encryption and proxies, finally arriving at the same site where he'd bought the board. The listing was gone, wiped clean like it never existed. But Jared didn't stop there. He started digging deeper, clicking through forums and chat rooms that made my skin crawl. That's when we found it. A thread buried deep in a forum dedicated to ancient occult practices, barely readable in broken English. Someone had posted a photo of the exact same Ouija board we'd used, symbols and all. The message attached to it was short, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. These are not human symbols. They are warnings from them. Do not play. Do not summon. They will mark you. It wasn't clear who they were, but I didn't need it spelled out to know it was bad news. My heartbeat quickened as I scrolled down the thread, but the replies offered nothing helpful. Just more people echoing the same sentiment. Do not play. Jared, being Jared, wasn't as quick to accept that answer. He kept searching, diving deeper into the site, when something strange happened. His screen flickered for a moment, like the signal was glitching out. Then, out of nowhere, a private message popped up. No username, no details, just the words, "They found you." We stared at the screen, frozen. A cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck, and I felt my own skin crawl, not from fear, but from the very real sensation of movement. I glanced down at my arm, and there it was. One of the symbols had shifted, now sitting an inch higher than where it had been just hours before. "They," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jared clicked on the message, his face pale. The screen went black for a second, and then a video began to play. It was grainy, shaky, like it had been filmed on some ancient camera. At first, I couldn't make out anything but static and blurry shapes. But then the image sharpened, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a room, dimly lit, with a single wooden table in the center. On that table was a Ouija board, our Ouija board, and sitting around it were people, or at least they looked like people at first. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow and dark. They were murmuring in some language I didn't recognize, and as the camera zoomed in, I realized something that turned my stomach. The same symbols that were on our skin were carved into theirs. Deep, raw cuts, like they had been etched in with something sharp. Their flesh pulsed with each breath they took, the symbols glowing faintly in the low light. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the video ended. We sat there in silence, the air in the room heavy with fear. Jared was the first to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They're real, whatever they are. They're coming for us." That was when the lights in my apartment flickered, and we both heard it, a soft scratching sound, like something dragging its nails across wood. It was coming from the hallway outside my door. The symbols on my skin were glowing now, faint but unmistakable. And for the first time, I realized what they really were. They weren't just marks. They were targets. And whatever was out there, it knew exactly where to find us. The scratching sound didn't stop. It was steady, deliberate, like someone, or something, was waiting outside my door, tracing the outline of it with claws. Jared and I locked eyes, neither of us wanting to acknowledge what was happening. But we couldn't ignore it. Whatever had marked us, whatever was on the other side of that door, wasn't going to just leave us alone. Jared grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, his hands shaking the entire time. It was a useless gesture, and we both knew it, but it was something. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the fact that we had no idea what was out there, or the realization that the symbols glowing on my skin seemed to be reacting. They pulsed faintly, like they were alive, syncing with the slow, rhythmic scraping from outside. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. The air in the room felt thicker, like it was pressing in on me. Jared was pacing, muttering to himself under his breath. This can't be real. This can't be happening. But it was. There was no denying that now. What do we do? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky. Jared didn't answer. He was too busy staring at his laptop, scrolling furiously through forums and old chat logs. But I knew it was pointless. Whatever this was, no one online was going to have an answer. We'd gone too far, opened something we couldn't close, and now we were paying the price. The scratching finally stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't hear anything. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. It was like the world outside that door had ceased to exist. For a second, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then Jared's phone buzzed. It was loud in the quiet apartment, startling both of us. He fumbled with it, his fingers slick with sweat, and when he finally got it out of his pocket, his face went pale. He turned the screen towards me without saying a word. It was a text message. "We see you." There was no number attached to it, no contact name, just those 3 words. My stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't just a threat. It felt like a promise. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, my phone buzzed too. Same message. "We see you." I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, the walls of the apartment closing in around me. Every part of my body screamed to run, to get out, but there was nowhere to go. We were trapped, surrounded by something we couldn't understand. And the worst part? They were right. They did see us. The marks on our skin, our glowing, pulsing marks, were like beacons, guiding whatever was out there straight to us. Jared's laptop screen flickered again, the image distorting for a moment, before a new window opened on its own. Another video, playing automatically. But this one was different from the last. The video showed me, sitting there in my living room, right at that very moment. I watched in horror as the camera slowly zoomed in on me from an angle just outside my apartment window. My blood went cold. Jared leaned closer to the screen, his hand hovering over the keyboard, too stunned to speak. I bolted to the window, flinging the curtains open, expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the quiet, still street outside. No people, no shadows, no movement at all. But the camera feed kept playing on the laptop, zooming closer and closer until it focused directly on the symbols glowing on my arm. "They're outside," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "They're watching us." Jared slammed the laptop shut, breaking the spell for a second. We stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. But there wasn't time to think. There wasn't time to figure out a plan. Because in that moment, my phone buzzed again. This time, the message was longer. "The symbols are the key. Show them, and we will stop." I stared at it, my mind racing. What did that even mean? Show them? Show who? The message didn't make sense, but nothing had made sense since the symbols had appeared on my skin. Jared's phone buzzed too. and I knew without looking it was the same message. He was shaking his head, pacing again. Number, no way. I'm not doing whatever they want. This is insane. I agreed. There was no way we were going to play into their game, whatever it was. But then, as if mocking us, the scratching sound started again, louder this time, more frantic. Something was out there, desperate to get in, and it wasn't going to wait much longer. And that's when I made the decision. I don't know if it was the fear or the exhaustion, but something snapped in me. I lifted my arm and pulled up my sleeve, exposing the twisting, glowing symbols to the door. Fine, I muttered under my breath, my voice trembling. You want to see them? Here they are. For a second, nothing happened. The scratching stopped, and the room fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, slowly, the temperature in the room dropped. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate, like the heat had been sucked out of the air. My breath fogged in front of me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to Jared, but before I could say anything, I heard it. A voice, whispering, not from the hallway, not from outside, but from inside my head. You've been chosen. I stumbled back, clutching my head as the whisper echoed inside my skull. It wasn't a normal voice. It didn't sound human. The words felt wrong, like they were pressing into my mind from the outside, forcing their way in. My vision swam, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. Jared was beside me in an instant, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. What's happening? He asked, but I couldn't answer. All I could hear was that voice, repeating the same phrase over and over. You've been chosen. The room was ice cold now, the temperature so low that I could see frost forming on the windows. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the symbols on my skin were glowing brighter, almost burning. I looked down at my arm and saw them shifting again, but this time they weren't just moving, they were aligning, coming together in a way that made sense, as if they were forming some kind of map or message. Jared must have noticed it too because he grabbed my wrist, his fingers trembling. What? What is that? Why are they changing? Before I could respond, the whispering stopped, and for a brief, terrifying moment, everything went silent again. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, like the world itself is holding its breath. Then the banging started. It wasn't the soft scratching from before. This was loud, violent, like someone, or something, was pounding against the door with all its strength. The whole apartment shook with the force of it, and the sound reverberated through my bones. Whatever was out there wasn't waiting anymore. It was trying to break in. I backed away, my heart racing, but Jared stood frozen, staring at the door like he was in some kind of trance. We have to go, I said, my voice cracking with fear. Jared, we need to leave now. But he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the door, his face slack, and when he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, empty, like it wasn't his own. They're not going to stop until we give them what they want. A cold shiver ran down my spine. What are you talking about? He turned to me, and I saw it. The same glow that was in the symbols on my skin had spread to his eyes. They were glowing faintly, an unnatural light that made my stomach churn. They want us to obey, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They want us to give in. I shook my head, backing away from him. Number, no, we can't do that. We don't even know what they want. The banging on the door grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the walls vibrating with the force of it. I didn't know how much longer the door would hold, and the thought of whatever was on the other side getting in was enough to send my mind spiraling. Jared was still staring at the door, his body stiff and unresponsive, like he was under some kind of spell. And then, slowly, he reached up and pulled back his sleeve, revealing the glowing symbols on his arm. It's the only way, he whispered, almost like he was trying to convince himself. If we show them, If we obey, maybe they'll stop. No, I snapped, stepping toward him. We can't give them what they want. We don't even know what they are. But Jared wasn't listening. He was too far gone, his mind already slipping into whatever hold they had over him. I could see it in his eyes, the fear, the desperation. He was breaking, and I didn't know how to pull him back. The banging stopped again. Silence. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, waiting for the next sound. But instead of more banging, I heard something else. A voice. Not in my head this time. No, this one was coming from the other side of the door. Open the door. It was soft, almost soothing, but there was something deeply wrong about it. It wasn't just the words, it was the way they were spoken. Like the person, or thing, on the other side already knew we wouldn't resist. Like they knew they had already won. Jared started walking toward the door. "Jared, don't!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. But he shook me off, his eyes distant and unfocused. "Open the door!" The voice came again, a little louder this time, more insistent. And Jared was going to listen. I had no choice. In a blind panic, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a lamp, and swung it hard, connecting with the side of his head. The sound was sickening, but he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't let him open that door, not when we didn't know what was waiting on the other side. I stood over him, panting, my hands trembling as I dropped the lamp. The apartment was so cold now that my breath was coming out in thick clouds and I could barely feel my fingers. The symbols on my skin were still glowing, pulsing with that unnatural light, and I could feel something stirring deep inside me, something dark and ancient. It was like the marks were alive, feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every second. The voice spoke again, but this time, it wasn't asking. "Open the door, or we will take him." I froze, staring at the door in horror. The marks on my skin flared up, burning hotter, and I knew that whatever was outside wasn't bluffing. They would take Jared, and if I didn't do something, they might take me too. But opening the door, that felt like an even worse fate. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, my body trembling with cold and fear. The apartment was filled with an oppressive, suffocating silence, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. The voice had stopped, but I knew it was still out there, waiting, watching. And then I remembered the message. The symbols are the key, the symbols on our skin. They weren't just marks, they were more than that. A key. But to what? I didn't have time to think. I knelt down beside Jared, frantically looking at the symbols on his arm, tracing them with my finger. They were still glowing, still pulsing with that eerie light. And as I traced the patterns, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The symbols, they weren't random. They were pointing to something, forming a shape, a map, leading to... I stood up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't opening that door. I stood there, my heart pounding so loud in my ears that it drowned out everything else. Jared lay unconscious on the floor, the symbols on his skin still glowing, pulsing in time with mine. The air in the room felt thick, pressing down on me, like something was holding its breath just outside the door. But I didn't move. I couldn't. The voice hadn't spoken again, but I knew whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was waiting, watching, and it wasn't going to leave empty-handed. The symbols, they were the key. That message kept repeating in my mind, over and over. The symbols on my skin weren't just marks. They meant something more than I could understand. I'd seen them shift, align, form patterns that seemed almost deliberate. But I had no idea what they were supposed to unlock. I glanced down at Jared, his chest rising and falling slowly. I couldn't let them take him. Whatever they were, whatever they wanted, I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of dragging him, us, into their nightmare. But I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know what the symbols were trying to tell me. Then, something caught my eye. On the floor, just beneath Jared's arm, was the Ouija board. I don't know how I hadn't noticed it before, but there it was, lying face down on the hardwood, the strange symbols carved into the back. The same symbols that were now etched into our skin. My heart skipped a beat as I knelt down and flipped the board over, staring at the markings. They weren't just random, they were identical to the ones glowing on my arm. The same twisting patterns, the same alien geometry. But now, as I looked closer, something clicked. The symbols on the board weren't just identical to ours, they were laid out in a sequence, a specific order, like instructions. And suddenly, I understood. The board wasn't a tool for communication. It wasn't a game. It was a map to something beyond, something ancient, something we weren't supposed to mess with. And by using it, we'd opened a door we didn't even know existed, a door we couldn't close. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stumbled backward, my eyes locked on the board. We hadn't just summoned something, we'd invited it into our world. And now, it wanted more. The scratching started again, louder this time, more insistent. The door shook with each blow, and I could hear something on the other side. Something big, something heavy, dragging itself toward us. My skin prickled with fear as the symbols on my arm flared up, burning hotter, glowing brighter. The pressure in the room grew unbearable, and I knew time was running out. I had to make a choice. The board, the symbols, the marks on my skin, they were all connected. And if I was right, if the symbols truly were the key, then there was one last thing I had to do. One final desperate gamble. I picked up the board and held it in my hands, my fingers trembling. The symbols on it were shifting now, moving in time with the ones on my skin, like they were alive, feeding off the energy in the room. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew I had no other option. Taking a deep breath, I held my arm over the board, aligning the glowing marks on my skin with the ones carved into the wood. The moment they touched, I felt it. A surge of electricity, like a shock running up my arm and into my chest. I gasped, the pain sharp and immediate, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The symbols began to pulse faster, growing brighter and brighter until they were blinding. The room around me seemed to warp, the walls bending, twisting, like reality itself was unraveling. The pressure in my head intensified, the voice from before whispering, louder now, more urgent. You've been chosen. Obey. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus. The light from the symbols was so bright now that it hurt to look at, but I kept my arm pressed against the board, refusing to let go. Then, all at once, everything stopped. The banging on the door, the scratching, the voice, silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I'd somehow done it, closed the door, stopped whatever was coming for us. But then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, painfully slowly, I turned my head, and there it was. It stood in the corner of the room, half hidden in shadow, but I could see its outline. Tall, too tall. Its limbs were long, unnaturally long, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. And its eyes glowed with the same light as the symbols on my skin, burning with an intensity that pierced through the darkness. It didn't move, it didn't speak, but I knew what it was. It was one of them, the thing from the dark web, the thing we'd summoned, the thing that had marked us. It had come for us. My body went numb with fear, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The creature's gaze was locked on me, unblinking, unwavering. It didn't need to speak. I could feel what it wanted, feel its hunger. It was waiting for me to make the choice, obey or be taken. The symbols on my skin flared one last time, burning hot, searing into my flesh. The pain was unbearable, and I cried out, dropping the board, clutching my arm as the marks burned brighter and brighter, consuming me from the inside out. And then, nothing. The light vanished, the symbols faded, and the creature was gone. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, my vision swimming. Jared was still unconscious beside me, his skin pale, the symbols on his body no longer glowing. The room was quiet, too quiet. I don't know how long I lay there, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but one thing was clear. It wasn't over. The symbols might have faded, but they were still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting, and whatever had come for us, it wasn't finished. Not yet.